One call CHANGED everything. Dr. Renata Sousa Whitfield had been reviewing occupational health compliance files for 11 days straight when the call came through on a Tuesday afternoon in March 2019. I was sitting in a temporary office on the 14th floor of Meridian Group's regional headquarters in Charlotte, North Carolina, a cup of cold coffee beside my laptop, and a stack of personnel records thick enough to use as a doorstop. My official title on the consulting contract read Director of Occupational Health Assessment, Regional Audit Division. Meridian Group had hired my firm, Asclepius Health Consultants, to conduct a full independent review of their workplace safety practices and sick leave administration across 7 states. They were preparing for a federal OSHA review and needed someone credible, someone thorough, someone completely outside the company. They had no idea what they were about to hand me. The name appeared on the sick leave denial log I had requested on day 3. I almost missed it. It was buried in a subfolder labeled Legacy Files, pre-2015 HR Administration, cross-referenced under a department code that no longer existed. The file number was SL 2013-47. The date of denial was October 14, 2013. The employee's name was listed as R. Sousa, Occupational Health Technician, Level II. Me. I sat with that file open on my screen for 6 minutes without moving. Then I picked up the phone. That single phone call set into motion everything that followed. But to understand why it landed the way it did, why my hands were completely steady when I dialed, why I already knew exactly what I was going to say, you need to understand where I started. You need to go back with me. 11 years back. Hello, everyone. Before I continue, if you have ever been told to push through when your body was failing you, when someone in authority decided your suffering was an inconvenience to their schedule, I want you to leave a comment below. I want to hear your story, because what I experienced in 2013 did not break me. It built me into something they never saw coming. Stay with me. I was 26 years old in October of 2013. I had been working as an occupational health technician, Level II, at Meridian Group's regional distribution hub in Greensboro, North Carolina for 14 months. It was not a glamorous job. I administered pre-employment physicals, tracked workplace injury reports, maintained the medical records database for 640 employees, and sat through more mandatory compliance training webinars than I care to remember. But I was good at it. My supervisor at the time, a methodical and deeply kind man named Gerald Occupatio, had already recommended me twice for the company's internal professional development program. I had an application in for a part-time graduate enrollment in public health at the University of North Carolina, an evening program I had researched for a year, mapped out tuition costs for, and quietly saved $4,200 toward from my own paychecks. That was October 7th. On October 12th, I woke up at 3 in the morning unable to move my head without the room spinning. By the time my alarm went off at 6, my temperature was 103.4 degrees. I called the employee health line, was placed on hold for 22 minutes, and finally reached a voice that identified itself as belonging to HR coordinator Donna Phelps-Warwick. I told Donna Phelps-Warwick that I had a fever above 103, that I was experiencing significant dizziness and muscle pain, and that I was requesting sick leave for the day under our company health policy, Section 4.2, which I had memorized because it was literally my job. Donna Phelps-Warwick's response was precise and delivered without inflection. "We have 2 people already out this week, Renata. We really need you on site. Can you push through? Take some Tylenol and get here by 9. I took the Tylenol. I got there by 9. By 3 in the afternoon, a colleague had to drive me home because I could no longer read the computer screen. The facility nurse, not me, I was too sick to be the facility nurse that day, which should tell you everything, took my temperature in the break room and told me to go to urgent care immediately. The reading was 105.1. I was diagnosed that evening with influenza A and a secondary ear infection that had begun affecting my balance. The urgent care physician, Dr. Priya Ganesh, told me I needed 5 to 7 days of rest and that returning to work before then would be medically inadvisable. I submitted the sick leave request the following morning. I included Dr. Ganesh's signed documentation. I included my temperature readings. I included everything. The denial came back in writing within 4 hours. The denial letter, signed by Regional HR Director Thomas Kellogg Barnes, stated that my sick leave request for October 14th through October 18th was denied on the grounds of operational need, and that I was expected to return no later than October 15th. The letter noted that any additional absence would be considered unexcused and could result in formal disciplinary action. I remember sitting on the edge of my bed holding that letter. My ears were ringing. My temperature was still 104.3. I remember thinking two very specific things in sequence. The first thought was, this is illegal and they do not think I know that. The second thought was, they are right that I do not know it well enough yet to prove it. Not yet. I wrote down the name of the graduate program on a piece of paper. Masters of Science in Occupational Health and Safety, Gilmore School of Public Health, University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I folded it and put it in my wallet. I kept it there for 6 years. I returned to work on October 15th as ordered. I did not file an immediate complaint. I did not confront Thomas Kellogg Barnes. I did not send an angry email. I sat at my desk, and I did my job, and I watched everything. Gerald Occupational brought me a cup of tea without being asked, and said nothing, which was the kindest possible response. Donna Phelps-Warwick walked past my workstation twice that morning and did not make eye contact either time. 3 weeks later, my application to the UNC Evening Public Health Program was rejected. The rejection letter cited my undergraduate GPA from my first 2 years at community college, a period of my life when I had been working 30 hours a week to pay rent and had not yet understood how to study efficiently. The letter was polite and standard and landed like a stone. I had been counting on that program. I had saved the $4,200 toward the first semester. I had already planned how I was going to arrange my work schedule around the evening classes. I put the rejection letter in my desk drawer and did not open that drawer again for a week. Gerald Occupational noticed. Gerald Occupational noticed everything. On a Wednesday afternoon in mid-November, he stopped by my workstation at the end of the day and placed a printed brochure on my keyboard. He did not say anything explanatory. He just said, "Read this when you get home." Then he picked up his coat and left. The brochure was for the Hargrove Institute for Occupational Medicine, a specialized professional training program based in Durham, run jointly through Duke University's Continuing Education Division and the North Carolina Department of Labor. It was an 18-month certificate program that could be completed on a hybrid schedule, evenings, and 1 Saturday per month. It was accredited for professional advancement in occupational health roles. The first cohort enrollment fee was $3,800, which was $440 less than my rejected program. I read that brochure 4 times. At the bottom of the last page, Gerald Occupational had written in blue pen, "I already talked to admissions. Your work record here is strong enough. Call Dr. Felicia Drummond Price by Friday." I called Dr. Felicia Drummond Price on Thursday morning. She was the director of professional enrollment at the Hargrove Institute, a precise, fast-talking woman who asked me 6 questions in 9 minutes, and then said, "Your transcript from community college doesn't worry me. Your last 14 months of actual work does. We have 1 slot left in the January cohort." "Do you want it?" I said yes before she finished the sentence. I enrolled in January 2014 using $3,800 of my own savings, which left me with exactly $412 in my account. I did not tell anyone at Meridian Group. I did not tell Thomas Kellogg Barnes. I did not tell Donna Phelps-Warwick. I told Gerald Occupational, who nodded once and said, "Good." That was the entire conversation. The Hargrove program was harder than I had anticipated. The cohort met on Tuesday and Thursday evenings from 6 to 9, and the Saturday sessions ran from 8 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. I was working full-time. I was exhausted in a way that was different from the fever exhausted of the previous October. This was a chosen exhaustion, a voluntary one, and it tasted completely different. I failed my first occupational toxicology exam with a 61. I passed the makeup with an 87. My cohort supervisor, a former OSHA regional director named Marcus Thibault, wrote in his feedback, "You have good instincts. Develop them systematically." I taped that feedback to the inside of my bathroom mirror. The family, my mother's side, the Sousa cousins, the aunts who had opinions about everything, knew I was taking some kind of class. They characterized it variously as that certificate thing, her little course, and from my Aunt Florinda, Renata playing doctor again. There was a family dinner in March of 2014 at my cousin Beatrice's house in High Point. Someone asked how the class was going. I said fine. My uncle Kitano, who ran a landscaping company and had very settled views on what constituted a real career, said, "You'd make more money in nursing. Why don't you just do nursing?" I said I'd think about it. I had already thought about it and had a different answer, but that dinner was not the place for it. My Aunt Florinda's contribution to the conversation was to note that she had heard there were good health insurance jobs at the hospital near her house that paid well and had good benefits. She meant well. She did not mean to be dismissive. But the net effect of the conversation was that no one at that table understood what I was actually building, and I left the dinner deciding that no one at that table needed to. I completed the Hargrove Institute Certificate Program in June 2015 with a final grade average of 91.4%. Marcus Thibault shook my hand at the completion ceremony and said, "I've already given your name to 2 people. Expect calls." He was not being figurative. The first call came in August 2015. It was from Corrigan Wellstone Occupational Health Associates, a mid-size consulting firm based in Raleigh that contracted with regional employers to provide third-party occupational health assessments and compliance support. The position they were describing was Senior Health Safety Technician, a step above my current Meridian Group role, with a salary of $54,000 annually plus benefits, including full health insurance coverage, and a professional development stipend of $2,000 per year. I interviewed on a Thursday. I was offered the position the following Monday. I gave Meridian Group my 2 weeks' notice on a Tuesday morning. I dropped the resignation letter on Thomas Kellogg Barnes's desk personally. He read it and said, "This is rather sudden." I said it wasn't, actually. Then I collected my things and went back to my workstation and spent my last 2 weeks making sure the medical records database was perfectly organized for whoever came next, because that was the job, and I intended to finish it correctly. At Corrigan Wellstone, the pace was different. I was no longer inside a single facility. I was moving between client sites across the Piedmont region, conducting health assessments, reviewing injury logs, auditing compliance documents. My direct supervisor was a woman named Sandra Lim-Carvalho, the firm's director of field operations, who had 17 years of occupational health experience and a talent for identifying precisely what a client was doing wrong before she had been in the building for 20 minutes. Sandra Lim-Carvalho was not warm in any conventional sense. She was exacting. She gave me feedback on my site reports that felt surgical. In the first 6 months, she revised my written assessments an average of 11 times per document. By month 8, she stopped revising them. In November 2016, I enrolled in the Master of Public Health program at the Gilmore School of Public Health, the same institution that had rejected me in 2013, though this time I was applying with 2.5 years of field experience, a Hargrove certificate, and a letter of support from Sandra Lim-Carvalho that I never read but that Sandra told me later was 3 pages long. I was accepted in December. I started in January 2017. Completing a part-time MPH while working full-time at a consulting firm is not something I would describe to anyone as pleasant. There were Saturdays in the spring of 2017 when I sat in the university library from 8 in the morning until midnight working on my epidemiology coursework, and then drove home and reviewed field assessment notes on my laptop in bed. There was a February night in 2018 when I genuinely considered withdrawing. I was sitting in my car in the parking lot of a client facility in Burlington at 10:30 at night, having just completed a 6-hour site review, and I had a 50-page assignment due in 48 hours that I had not started. I sat there for 11 minutes. I drove home and started the assignment. I finished the MPH in August 2018. The hooding ceremony was on a Saturday afternoon, and I sat in a folding chair in a university gymnasium with my academic hood placed over my shoulders by the dean of the Gilmore School, a white-haired man named Dr. Reginald O. Simensa, who shook my hand and said, "Well done, doctor," and then corrected himself. "Well done, Ms. Sousa. Graduate, not physician, though give it time." He was joking. I smiled. I noted the opening. I did not attend the family dinner that Aunt Florinda held that same evening. I said I had a prior commitment. I did. Corrigan Wellstone promoted me to Associate Director of Occupational Health Assessment in September 2018 at a salary of $78,000 annually. Sandra Lim-Carvalho announced the promotion at a Friday afternoon staff meeting and said, Renata has spent the last 3 years becoming the most thorough evaluator in this firm. We would be foolish not to recognize that formally. 4 of my colleagues applauded. One did not, but I had a clear professional read on that particular colleague, and it did not concern me. In January 2019, Sandra Lim Carvalho called me into her office and closed the door. She told me that Corrigan Wellstone had been awarded the Meridian Group regional audit contract. She told me she was assigning me as lead auditor. She looked at me with an expression that was as close to mischief as Sandra Lim Carvalho ever got, and she said, "I know your history with that company. You don't have to take this assignment." I said, "Sandra, of course I'm taking it." She nodded once. I assumed, here's the file. The Meridian Group audit contract was valued at $240,000. My firm had been engaged to conduct a comprehensive independent review of Meridian's occupational health and safety practices across their southeastern regional portfolio, including sick leave administration, medical records management, return-to-work protocols, and compliance with federal and state workplace health statutes. I would have full access to all HR files. I would have full access to all medical documentation maintained by their employee health offices. I would have authority to interview any employee, any supervisor, any HR administrator in the region. Meridian Group would cooperate fully. They had signed a contract saying so. I spent 3 days reading every page of the contract before I stepped foot in their building. I called my attorney, a sharp and methodical woman named Claire Oduya Pennington of Oduya Pennington Legal Advisors in Durham, who had handled my professional consulting agreements for 2 years. I walked Claire through the assignment specifics and asked her to confirm that the scope of my access was as comprehensive as I understood it to be. She reviewed the contract language over 48 hours and confirmed. My authority under the audit engagement was full and unqualified. Whatever I found, I had the standing to report it, document it, and recommend action on it. I told Claire I appreciated the confirmation. I did not tell Claire what I already knew I was going to find. I arrived at Meridian Group's Charlotte headquarters on February 25, 2019. I was introduced to the company's current regional VP of Human Resources, a man named Douglas Fairweather-Chen, who walked me to my temporary office, shook my hand, and said, "We want to be fully transparent with you, Dr. Whitfield. Whatever you find, we want to know about it." I thanked him. I put my laptop on the desk. I requested the complete archive of sick leave denial records from 2010 to the present. I had the files by the end of day 1. I found SL 2013-47 on day 3. Then I spent 8 more days reviewing every other file in that archive, 114 additional sick leave denials over a 5-year period, a pattern so consistent in its structure that it could not possibly have been coincidental, a set of medical records and documentation so clearly in violation of applicable federal guidelines that the OSHA Review Meridian was so worried about was going to be the least of their problems. And then it was day 11. It was a Tuesday afternoon in March. I had a cup of cold coffee and a stack of files and a phone in my hand. My colleague at Corrigan Wellstone, a former labor relations specialist named James Ibarra Park, who had joined the firm 6 months earlier and whom I had briefed on the audit's general parameters, had asked me at the start of the assignment how I was feeling about returning to a client with that kind of personal history. I had told him the truth. I feel calm. He had looked at me carefully and said, "You've been waiting for this a long time, haven't you?" I had said, "I've been building toward it, there's a difference." He had smiled and said, "I'm glad you're on my side, Renata." The morning I found the file, I had thought about calling the family, about calling Aunt Florinda and saying, "You remember Meridian Group? You remember when I worked there?" I had thought about it for approximately 45 seconds. Then I had closed that thought down and returned to work. She had no idea what I had become. None of them did, and I had every intention of keeping it that way. The call I made on that Tuesday afternoon in March went to a direct line. A voice answered on the second ring. The voice belonged to Thomas Kellogg Barnes, who still worked at Meridian Group, who was now listed as Senior HR Policy Consultant, who had no idea that the woman conducting the independent audit of his company's sick leave administration history was the same woman whose request for sick leave he had denied in writing on October 14, 2013, when her temperature was 105 degrees, and he had told her that her suffering was an operational inconvenience. I introduced myself. I told him I was the lead auditor on the Corrigan Wellstone engagement. I told him I needed to schedule a formal interview regarding specific personnel decisions made between 2012 and 2015 in the Greensboro Regional Distribution Hub. I told him the interview would be recorded and that he was welcome to have legal representation present. There was a pause. He said, "Of course, Dr. Whitfield, I'm happy to cooperate." I said, "Wonderful. I'll send the formal meeting notice by end of day." I put the phone down. I looked out the 14th floor window at Charlotte's midday skyline, the light flat and gray in that particular way that March light in the Carolinas sometimes is, the city going about its Tuesday with complete indifference to what had just been set in motion. I had come that close to everything surfacing before it was time, but it wasn't time yet. The formal notice went to Thomas Kellogg Barnes at 4:57 that afternoon. The meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning. Between now and then, I had 7 more personnel files to review, 2 more interviews to conduct with current HR staff, and 1 call still to make to Claire Oduya Pennington at Oduya Pennington Legal Advisors. Not because I needed legal guidance on the audit, because I needed to understand exactly what 115 documented violations of federal sick leave guidelines looked like when they were presented to a federal oversight body by the person who had been violation number 47. Claire Oduya Pennington picked up on the first ring. That was unusual. Claire was a woman who returned calls on her own schedule, which was precise and unhurried and belonged entirely to her. When she answered immediately, I understood that she had been expecting me to call sooner than I had. "I found it," I said. "I assumed you would," she said. "How many additional records?" 114. Same pattern. Same authorization signature on the denial letters for the bulk of the 2012 through 2014 period. The documentation they kept is thorough. They essentially built the case against themselves. There was a brief silence on Claire's end that I recognized as her thinking, not her hesitating. Then she said, "Renata, you understand that your dual position here, as audit lead and as a named subject in the historical records, creates a disclosure obligation." "I know," I said. "I need to know the exact parameters of that obligation before my interview with Thomas Kellogg Barnes on Thursday. I'll have a memo to you by Wednesday morning." "Thank you, Claire." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "This is going to require precision." I put my phone down and sat in the gray March light for another few minutes. Somewhere below the 14th floor, Charlotte was having a Tuesday. Taxis were moving. People were buying coffee. Thomas Kellogg Barnes was presumably sitting in his own office somewhere in this building, having no particular feelings about Thursday. I pulled the SL 2013-47 file back onto my screen and read it again from the beginning. The denial letter was scanned and clean. Thomas Kellogg Barnes's signature was legible. The attached documentation, my original sick leave request, Dr. Priya Ganesh's signed urgent care note, the temperature log was all present. Meridian Group had kept everything. They had denied my request in writing, with full medical documentation attached, and then filed all of it neatly in a subfolder where it had sat for nearly 6 years, waiting. I thought about the evening I had driven home from the urgent care clinic with a diagnosis of influenza A and a secondary ear infection, and a written instruction to rest for 5 to 7 days. I thought about sitting on the edge of my bed with that denial letter in my hands, my ears ringing, my temperature still climbing, and the 2 thoughts arriving in sequence. This is illegal, and I do not know it well enough yet to prove it. I knew it now. The memo from Claire arrived at 7:43 on Wednesday morning. It was 4 pages, single-spaced, and characteristically precise. Core of it was this: as audit lead, I was obligated to disclose my personal stake in the historical records to the client before submitting my final report. That disclosure did not invalidate my audit findings. It did not require me to recuse myself from the engagement. It did require that the disclosure be made formally, in writing, with a copy retained by all parties before my report was finalized. Claire had drafted the disclosure language. It was 3 paragraphs. It was exact. I read the memo twice. Then I printed the disclosure draft, folded it, and put it in the left breast pocket of my blazer. I wore it there for the rest of Wednesday like a document that understood it had a job to do and was content to wait until the right moment. The Thursday interview with Thomas Kellogg Barnes took place in a small conference room on the 9th floor. He arrived 2 minutes early, which I noted. He had no legal representation with him, which I also noted. He was a man in his late 50s with close-cut gray hair and the practiced, slightly preemptive courtesy of someone who had spent decades managing uncomfortable conversations by being the first person to make them comfortable. He shook my hand. He smiled. He said he was happy to be as helpful as possible. I thanked him. I opened my notebook. And I began. The interview lasted 2 hours and 17 minutes. I asked him about sick leave administration policy and who held authorization authority in the 2012 to 2015 period. I asked him about the operational need criteria that justified denial decisions. I asked him about training received by HR coordinators regarding federal guidelines. I asked him about the appeals process available to denied employees. He answered every question with professional fluency. He was good at this. He had been doing it for a long time. He did not know, as he answered, that I had 115 denial records on my laptop. He did not know that I had the disclosure letter folded in my breast pocket. He did not know that Claire Oduya Pennington had already placed a call to the OSHA Region IV office in Atlanta to clarify the reporting pathway for third-party audit findings that included evidence of systemic federal violations. He did not know any of it. What he did know, by the end of the 2 hours and 17 minutes, was that I asked very precise questions. I saw him register this at the 40-minute mark, a slight recalibration behind his eyes, a fractional increase in the care he took before answering. He became more deliberate. He chose his words with more attention. But he had no frame of reference for why this particular auditor was asking these particular questions with this particular quality of attention, and so he attributed it to professional thoroughness and continued cooperating. When I thanked him at the close of the interview and told him he would hear from me by the following Friday, he stood and shook my hand again and said, "Of course, Dr. Whitfield, we appreciate your rigor." I said, "I appreciate your cooperation." I walked back to my temporary office. I sat down. I looked at the Charlotte skyline again. Then I opened my laptop and began writing the audit report. The full audit report took 9 days to complete. It was 63 pages. It documented 115 sick leave denials issued between January 2012 and December 2016 across Meridian Group's North Carolina regional portfolio, the majority of which were found to be in violation of applicable federal guidelines under the Family and Medical Leave Act and relevant state workplace health statutes. It documented the pattern of authorization, the consistent involvement of specific HR administrators across the denial period, and the absence of any formal appeals process made available to affected employees. It documented the failure to provide required written notice of employee rights at the point of denial. On page 41, it documented SL 2013-47 specifically. It named the employee. It named the authorizing administrator. It reproduced the denial letter language. It noted that the employee had submitted a signed medical certification from a treating physician and that the denial had been issued 4 hours after the certification's receipt. On page 42, it disclosed that the employee named in SL 2013-47 was the lead auditor on the current engagement. It included Claire's 3-paragraph disclosure language verbatim. It included Claire's professional letterhead as an appendix, confirming that the disclosure had been reviewed by independent legal counsel and that the audit findings were not materially affected by the auditor's personal stake in the historical records, as the documentation supporting those findings was drawn entirely from Meridian Group's own archived files. I submitted the report to Douglas Fairweather Chen on a Friday afternoon in March, electronically and by certified mail. I submitted a copy simultaneously to the OSHA Region IV office in Atlanta through the formal third-party audit reporting pathway that Claire had identified. I sent a courtesy copy to Claire. Then I drove back to Raleigh, walked into my apartment for the first time in 11 days, ate a bowl of soup, and slept for 11 hours. Sandra Lim Carvalho called me the following Monday. She had read the report over the weekend. She said, "Renata, this is exceptional work." I said, "It was a thorough file." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Page 42. "Yes," I said, "you should have told me before the assignment." "I know," I said, "I'm telling you now." Another pause. Then Sandra said, "The disclosure is airtight, Claire's language is good, the findings stand." One more beat. "You could have been removed from this assignment the moment you found that file. You chose to disclose it in the report itself." "I disclosed it at the earliest point where the disclosure would be legally complete," I said. The report is the formal instrument. Claire confirmed the timing was within obligation parameters. Sandra made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You are the most deliberate person I have ever employed, she said. I want you in my office Friday morning. We need to talk about what comes next for you. What came next, as it turned out, had been set in motion before Sandra and I had that conversation. Because the OSHA Region IV office in Atlanta had received the report, and the OSHA Region IV office in Atlanta had a process for situations like this one, a process that involved contacting the employer directly with a notice of investigation and a request for response documentation within 30 days. Meridian Group received that notice on a Thursday morning in early April. I know this because Douglas Fairweather Chen called me that same Thursday. His professional courtesy was still intact, but there was a quality in his voice that had not been there in February, a careful, managed quality, the sound of a man who had just understood that a situation was significantly larger than he had believed it to be. He said, Dr. Whitfield, I want you to know that Meridian Group takes these findings very seriously. I said, I'm glad to hear that. He said, we're in the process of retaining legal counsel to respond to the OSHA notice. I said, that sounds like an appropriate step. He said, we would also like to discuss the possibility of a direct engagement with your firm for remediation consulting. A pause. And I want to say personally, the situation involving your own employment history with this company, I want you to know that I find that deeply concerning. I said, thank you, Mr. Fairweather Chen. After I hung up, I sat at my desk in the Corrigan Wellstone office in Raleigh and thought about Thomas Kellogg Barnes, sitting somewhere in the Meridian Group building in Charlotte with a legal team being assembled around him and a 30-day response deadline bearing down. I thought about Donna Phelps-Warwick, who might or might not still be with the company, who had told me to take some Tylenol and get there by 9. I thought about what it had taken to sit across from Thomas Kellogg Barnes in that 9th-floor conference room for 2 hours and 17 minutes and ask him precise questions with an entirely neutral expression. I thought, I hope I never have to do anything that difficult again. And then, immediately, I would do it again without hesitation. The OSHA investigation formally opened in May 2019. Meridian Group retained outside legal counsel, a firm out of Washington, D.C. that specialized in labor law defense. The investigation focused on the systemic pattern of violations documented in the audit report. The individual file SL 2013-47 was one piece of a larger evidentiary picture, which was precisely why I had written the report the way I had. The disclosure on page 42 was significant, but it was not the center of gravity. The center of gravity was 115 files. No attorney was going to argue around 115 files. What happened next was not fast. Federal investigations do not move quickly, and they should not. Proper process takes the time it requires. I returned to other client work. I had 4 additional audit engagements between May and December of 2019. I attended 2 professional conferences. I presented a paper on return-to-work protocol design at the American College of Occupational and Environmental Medicine annual meeting in October, and the paper was well received, and someone from the Gilmore School reached out afterward to ask if I would be interested in teaching a seminar course the following spring. I said I would think about it. I was thinking about a great many things in the fall of 2019. The call from Aunt Florinda came on a Sunday evening in November. I was at my kitchen table working through seminar course materials when my phone lit up with her name. I answered. She said, Renata, have you heard about what's happening with your cousin Beatrice's husband? I said I had not. What followed was a 20-minute account of a situation involving Beatrice's husband, Marco, who worked in regional insurance sales and had apparently made some professional decisions that had created difficulties, the details of which Aunt Florinda delivered with the particular blend of alarm and relish that characterized her relationship to family news. The substance of the situation was that Marco was under investigation by his employer for irregularities in how he had been documenting client health insurance coverage on certain policy applications. Specifically, whether clients had been accurately informed about what their insurance policy actually covered versus what Marco had represented it as covering. I listened. I said the appropriate things. I said I was sorry to hear it and that I hoped it resolved. After Aunt Florinda finished with Marco, she circled back to me in the way she always did, asking how work was going, whether I was keeping busy, whether I had considered that hospital administrator position she had seen advertised. I said work was going well. I said I was teaching a seminar in the spring. She said, "Oh, like a class?" "Yes," I said, "like a class." "That's nice," she said. "Does it pay well?" I said it paid adequately. After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a moment and thought about what Aunt Florinda did not know. She did not know about the OSHA investigation. She did not know about the audit report. She did not know about page 42. She did not know about the Gilmore School seminar, or the conference paper, or the conversation I had the previous week with Sandra Lim Carvalho about the possibility of my moving into a director-level role at Corrigan Wellstone. She did not know that a week earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon, I had received a formal letter from OSHA's Region IV office acknowledging receipt of supplementary documentation that Claire O'Duya Pennington had filed on my behalf, related to my individual case within the investigation. A filing that, if the investigation resulted in a finding of violation, would position me as a documented affected party, with standing to pursue remediation through the appropriate channel. The letter was in a manila folder on my kitchen counter. I could see it from where I was sitting. I called Claire O'Duya Pennington that evening. I signed the first document. There was no going back. The document I signed was a formal declaration of affected party status within the OSHA investigation, attesting that I was the employee named in SL 2013-47, that the sick leave denial had caused documentable professional and financial impact. Including the $4,200 of personal savings I had directed toward the Hargrove Institute program that I had enrolled in specifically, because my application to the UNC program had been rejected during the period when I was employed at Meridian Group, and that I was seeking remediation consistent with applicable federal guidelines. Claire had prepared the declaration with her usual exactness. We had discussed every line of it over 2 phone calls and 1 in-person meeting at her office in Durham. James Ibarra Park, who had followed the audit engagement's aftermath with interest and whom I had kept loosely informed, had sent me a text that evening that read, "Everything in order," I replied. "Everything in order." I put my phone down and looked at the signed declaration on my kitchen table. It was 2 pages. It had my signature on the second page and Claire's notary stamp beside it. It was dated November 19, 2019. I thought about the piece of paper I had written a graduate program name on 6 years earlier, the way I had folded it and put it in my wallet. The way I had carried it. I had carried something much more significant in my jacket pocket to a 9th-floor conference room in Charlotte. The difference was that this time, the document had teeth. The preparation that followed was methodical and quiet and took 4 months. Claire gathered the documentation package. Dr. Ganesh's original urgent care notes from 2013, the denial letter signed by Thomas Kellogg Barnes, the email chain between me and Donna Phelps-Warwick on October 12th, the return-to-work directive, my salary records from Meridian Group for the period of employment, and the financial documentation showing the $4,200 I had withdrawn from my personal savings account in January 2014 to pay the Hargrove Institute enrollment fee. A withdrawal I could trace to a specific bank statement, which I had kept. I had kept everything. I had kept it for 6 years in a fireproof box under my bed. The medical records from the urgent care visit were formally requested through the proper channel. Dr. Ganesh had moved her practice twice since 2013, but the records existed, they were complete, and they arrived in Claire's office by certified mail in December 2019. One afternoon in January 2020, James Ibarra Park stopped by my office door at Corrigan Wellstone. He had been preparing materials for a different client engagement, and he had a cup of coffee, and he leaned in the doorframe in the way people do when they have something to say but want to frame it casually. He said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." He said, "When did you know, not about finding the file, when did you know it was going to come to this?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "October 2013. In a different way then than I know it now." But the direction was always the same. He nodded. He said, 6 years of carrying that." I said, "I wasn't carrying it, I was building toward it, there's a difference." He smiled at his coffee cup. He said, "You said that to me once before." "It bears repeating," I said. He looked up. "How are you actually, not professionally, actually?" I looked at him for a moment. James Ibarra Park was a careful man with a good instinct for the emotional register of a situation, which is why he was good at labor relations and why I trusted him. I said, I'm more settled than I expected to be. I thought getting to this point would feel more like arriving somewhere. It feels more like finishing a calculation that I started a long time ago. He said, that sounds lonely. I said, it was parts of it. He said, is there someone? Yes, I said, there is. And I smiled at him, and he smiled back, and that was the end of that particular conversation, but I was glad he had asked. His name was Daniel Ferrer Osai. He was a physical therapist with a private practice in Chapel Hill. We had met at a professional conference 18 months earlier, and he had a calm, unhurried quality that I had recognized immediately as something I wanted near me, and he had asked if I wanted to get coffee after the panel session, and I had said yes. He knew the broad outlines of the Meridian situation. He did not know the specifics of what Claire and I were preparing. He knew enough to understand that I was in the middle of something significant, and he gave me the room for it without disappearing from the picture, which is a rarer quality than people tend to acknowledge. The close call came in February 2020. I was at my parents' house for a Sunday dinner. My mother's sister, Aunt Florinda, was there. My cousin Beatrice was there. The situation with Marco had resolved, inconclusively, as these things sometimes do. My mother had made feijoada, which took all day, and meant the house smelled the way it was supposed to smell on a Sunday. It was the kind of evening that was almost entirely good, which made the moment that occurred near the end of it more complicated. Aunt Florinda, in the course of a conversation about property and whether my parents had thought about what would happen to their house eventually, a conversation that was well-intentioned if poorly timed, turned to me and said, Renata, you've been doing all this audit work. Don't you work with lawyers sometimes? Employment lawyers, I said, sometimes, yes, depending on the engagement. She said, so you would know if an employee felt they'd been treated unfairly at work years ago, is there anything they could do, or is it too late after so long? The table was quiet for a moment. My mother was looking at her feijoada. Beatrice was looking at me. I said, it depends on the situation. Federal workplace violations have specific statutes of limitations, but there are circumstances where the clock can be told, paused, effectively, under certain investigative frameworks. I said it in the same register I used to explain procedural details at professional conferences. Clear, informational, entirely unagitated. Aunt Florinda nodded slowly. She said, so it's possible. I said, in certain circumstances, yes. She said, interesting, and moved on to asking Beatrice about her daughter's school situation. I picked up my fork. My hands were flat and steady on the table. I ate my mother's feijoada and participated in the rest of the conversation, and drove home at 9:15 and sat in my car in my apartment parking lot for 3 minutes. That was the moment I understood exactly how much they had underestimated me. The OSHA investigation concluded formally in April 2020. The findings document was 47 pages and determined that Meridian Group had engaged in a pattern of systematic violation of the Family and Medical Leave Act across its North Carolina regional portfolio between 2012 and 2016, encompassing 115 documented instances. The finding required Meridian Group to implement a comprehensive remediation program under OSHA oversight to provide back pay and compensatory remediation to identified affected employees, and to submit to a 2-year monitoring period with quarterly compliance reporting. Thomas Kellogg Barnes was identified in the findings document as the primary authorizing administrator for the pattern of denials during the core violation period. His continued employment with Meridian Group in any HR policy capacity was determined to be inconsistent with the remediation program's requirements. He was not named in a criminal proceeding. He was, however, no longer employed at Meridian Group by the end of May 2020. The remediation for affected employees was administered through a formal process. Claire Oduya Pennington filed my individual claim on my behalf in May 2020 with the full documentation package: the medical records, the denial letter, the financial records, the bank statement showing the $4,200, the salary documentation, the Hargrove Institute enrollment confirmation. Claim documented economic impact: the $4,200 in personal funds redirected to alternative professional training as a direct consequence of the denial, and its effect on my employment situation. the estimated earnings differential between my Meridian Group salary and a comparable position I had been unable to pursue during the period of disruption. The settlement figure for my individual claim was confirmed in writing on September 14, 2020. It was $22,400. I wired $4,200 of it to a professional development scholarship fund at the Hargrove Institute the same week. I had spoken with Dr. Felicia Drummond Price, who was still there, still fast-talking, still asking 6 questions in 9 minutes, about establishing a named annual scholarship for working adults pursuing occupational health certification as non-traditional students. We called it the Gerald Occupatio Professional Advancement Award. Gerald had retired from Meridian Group in 2017. When I called to tell him, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Well," and then he said, "Good." It was the most he had ever said about the whole of it, and it was exactly enough. I did not tell anyone in the family about the settlement, not my mother, not Aunt Florinda, not Beatriz. There was no announcement, no dramatic disclosure, no Sunday dinner revelation. The settlement was a documented, institutional outcome. It had occurred in the appropriate setting, through the appropriate process, confirmed by the appropriate authority. That was what it needed to be. Sandra Lim Carvalho, who had known the full scope of the situation by that point, said when I told her the settlement figure, "Is that enough?" I said, "It's the correct amount under the applicable framework." She gave me the look she reserved for moments when she thought I was being overly precise as a way of avoiding a more personal answer. So I added, "And yes, it's enough." In January 2021, I accepted the Director of Occupational Health Assessment position at Corrigan Wellstone that Sandra had discussed with me over a year earlier. The title was the one that had appeared on my consulting contract with Meridian Group in 2019, Director of Occupational Health Assessment, Regional Audit Division. I had been assigned that title for the Meridian engagement specifically because it was accurate for the scope of work. Now it was my actual permanent title, with a full departmental mandate and a team of 4 field assessors reporting to me. The Gilmore School seminar ran for 3 semesters. It became a full elective course in occupational health law and compliance. Dr. Reginald Osei Mensah, the dean who had corrected himself at my MPH hooding ceremony, attended the first session as an observer and afterward told me the course was exactly what the program had been missing. Daniel Ferrer Osei proposed in October 2021 in a Chapel Hill restaurant where we had eaten on our 3rd date. He had planned it with a specificity that I found entirely characteristic and entirely right. We married in April 2022. James Ibarra Park was there. Sandra Lim Carvalho was there. Gerald Occupatio was there. Marcus Thibault, my cohort supervisor from the Hargrove Institute, sent a card with a handwritten note that said, "You developed your instincts systematically. I always knew you would." Aunt Florinda was there, because she is my family and I love her in the complicated way that you love people who have never quite seen you and whom you have never quite stopped hoping will. She danced at the reception and cried at the ceremony and said afterward that it was the most beautiful wedding she had ever attended. I thanked her, I held her hand for a moment. I did not tell her about any of it. I had decided, years earlier, that the story was not for her. It was for me. I teach 2 courses at the Gilmore School now. I lead a team of 7 at Corrigan Wellstone. My annual audit portfolio covers 11 states. Last year, my team's findings contributed to remediation outcomes for 238 workers across 4 separate federal investigations. None of those workers know my name. That is exactly how it should be. There is a framed copy of the Gerald Occupatio Professional Advancement Award announcement on my office wall. Beside it, in a small frame that I bought for $8 at a hardware store, is a folded piece of paper. If you unfolded it, you would read, Masters of Science in Occupational Health and Safety, Gilmore School of Public Health, University of North Carolina at Greensboro. The paper is creased from 6 years in a wallet. The ink is slightly faded. I kept it. I have thought, over the years, about Thomas Kellogg Barnes. About what he understood in that 9th-floor conference room, about the woman sitting across the table from him asking precise questions about sick leave authorization. I think he understood nothing until page 42. And I think page 42 was the appropriate moment for him to understand. Not the conference room, not the interview. The formal document, in the formal record, in the language that institutions use when they are done being polite and are beginning to be consequential. I have thought about Donna Phelps Warwick. I do not know where she is. I hope she is well. I hope, if she is still working in HR, that she has a better understanding now of what it costs a person to be told to take some Tylenol and get there by 9. I have thought about the folded piece of paper in my wallet, about the $4,200, about the fireproof box under my bed that held 6 years of a story nobody knew I was telling. And I have thought about this. At no point during those 6 years did I build what I built in order to do what I did. I built what I built because I had decided, on the edge of my bed with a 105-degree fever and a denial letter in my shaking hands, that no one was going to define the ceiling of what I was capable of. The collision with Meridian Group was a consequence of that decision, not the purpose of it. The purpose was the work. The purpose was Gerald Occupatio's note at the bottom of a brochure. The purpose was Dr. Felicia Drummond Price asking 6 questions in 9 minutes. The purpose was Marcus Thibault writing on a feedback form, "You have good instincts, develop them systematically." The purpose was every file I had read, every site I had walked, every worker I had looked at across a conference table and said, "This is what your employer is required to provide you, and here is how you document it when they don't." That was the purpose. Everything else was consequence. And if there's anything this experience taught me, it's this. 1. The most durable form of response to someone who has underestimated you is not an argument. It is a document, signed and dated and filed in the right place, that they will eventually have to read. 2. What you build in silence, built correctly, with the right people and the right credentials and the right institutional footing, cannot be dismantled by the same casual indifference that tried to stop you at the beginning. 3. You are allowed to become something that the people who doubted you have no framework to understand, and you are allowed to let that be enough, without ever explaining yourself to them. Was I wrong to sit across from Thomas Kellogg Barnes for 2 hours and 17 minutes without telling him who I was? Tell me in the comments. If this story gave you strength, hit that like button. It means more than you know.